So you can become addicted to substances. You become addicted to behaviors like gambling. You can become addicted to sex. Sex addiction is real. It doesn't just mean that you like to have a lot of sex. It doesn't mean that you like non-normative sex practices. We'll talk a little bit about the details of that. What determines whether or not the potential of addiction for a certain substance? So in these numbers vary a bit cross-culturally, but in North America and Western Europe, of all the people who ever tried alcohol, about 4% of people are alcohol addicts. And of all the people who ever try cannabis, about 8% of people become cannabis addicts. And of all the people who ever try cocaine, about 20% become cocaine addicts. And of all the people who ever try heroin, about 30% become heroin addicts. And of all people who ever try cigarettes, about 80% become cigarette addicts. You might think, what? That doesn't make any sense, because the pleasure buzz you get from a cigarette is much more subtle than the pleasure buzz that you get from heroin. Why is that? And it has to do with the fact that the development of addiction is just a specialized form of learning. It's you associating the act of taking the drug with the pleasure that you receive. Now imagine, by analogy, you've got a dog, and you're trying to train your dog to come and call. You have a steak. You say, hey Fido, come Fido, come Fido. Fido comes, and you give Fido the entire steak. And then your steak is gone for that day. So Fido comes, gets a big reward, and then you're done. And then you go and do this the next day, and eventually Fido will learn to come and call it. And imagine you take a different strategy. You take your steak, you cut it into 200 little pieces. Come Fido, a little bit. Come Fido, a little bit. You repeat that over and over. By the end of the day, Fido has learned. When you smoke a pack of cigarettes, right, you're taking about 200 puffs. So it's a very small reward, but it follows the action. So when you puff on a cigarette, nicotine hits your brain about a second later, and you get that subtle reward, and then you're repeating that 200 times. You are training your inner dog very, very effectively. Whereas, if you're a heroin addict, you inject heroin. You get the big reward that's like that whole steak at once, but then you're probably not going to shoot up again for another 12 hours or so. That is the reason why cigarettes, in spite of being rather weak in their psychoactive effect, are so very addictive. It's because you repeat them very often, and because the lag between the action of puffing and feeling the pleasure is very, very small. So likewise, imagine you're trying to train your dog, and you say, come Fido, and Fido comes, and then you wait 20 minutes and give Fido the steak. Right? Well, you know, that association is not going to be very good. Right? And the same thing happens in all forms of learning, including the special case of addiction. So, let's imagine, what is addiction? Well, you know, we tend to overuse the term a lot in popular culture. We say addiction to mean something we just like a lot. Like, oh, I'm addicted to having a Starbucks latte every morning. I'm addicted to sleeping on 600 count sheets. I'm addicted to, you know, watching that show about zombies. So, no, of course, those aren't addictions. So let's imagine that we have a heroin addict, and a gambling addict, and a sex addict, and they all write their little autobiographies about their addiction. And I have them on in front of me, but before I go to reading them, I get one of you in the audience to go through and edit it and take out all the specific references to heroin or gambling or sex. What would I be left with is 3 examples of the exact same story. And the story would go like this. Well, I did this thing. It was great. It was pleasurable. I felt really good. And then, so I did it some more, and that was fine. And then as I did it more, I realized that it needed to do with a higher dose or a higher frequency in order to get the same pleasure that I originally got with more moderate consumption. And that process is called development tolerance. And then I noticed that as time went on, slowly, all of my liking got transformed into wanting. All the pleasure reached away. So that in the end, I was taking this heroin, gambling, or having this compulsive sex, not because it felt good, not because it was pleasurable, but just because I needed to do it to avoid the withdrawal symptoms. I needed to do it to fall asleep at night, to wake up in the morning, to interact minimally with other people. And this is the trajectory of addiction. So for example, when we talk about, is sex addiction real? Yeah, it is real. But a late-stage sex addict is someone who isn't taking pleasure in sex anymore. So if you're taking pleasure, if you're concerned about your sex life, and if you're still taking pleasure in sex, you're not a sex addict. Berlusconi, he's not a sex addict. He seems to still really like it. I don't know. That's what he says. I don't have to personally. All right, so what determines who becomes an addict and who doesn't? And it's a complicated answer. And in North America, it seems is about 40% of the variation in the propensity to become an addict can be accounted for by inherited factors, by genetics. Now that doesn't mean that there's one addiction gene. There isn't. There are a whole set of genes where variation in these genes can change your propensity to become an addict. And some of them that we are identified now, and there are many more that have yet to be identified. But we can, by studying patterns of family inheritance, and twins and adopted twins, we can come up with this estimate of the fraction of variance that we can attribute to genetics. So what's the rest? Well, the rest is the sum of your life experience. Actually, it's your life experience starting in utero, it turns out. And here, the biggest determinant is stress. You might think, oh, stress. He's not a biologist anymore. Now he's turned into a psychologist. This is stupid. Well, stress is not just a psychological phenomenon. Stress is explicitly biological. So if you're fighting off an infection, or you have an argument with your sweetheart, or you're sacked from your job, or you've been audited by the IRS, all of those things cause a cascade of stress responses, one of which involve the secretion of steroid hormones from your adrenal glands. And these hormones pass into your bloodstream, and they pass into your brain, and they bind receptors in the neurons that are in your brain's medial forebrain pleasure circuit. And they set in motion a series of biochemical, structural, and electrical changes that make you crave. So this process of developing addiction is an explicitly biological process. And it involves changes to the neurons of the ventral tegmental area of the nucleus accumbens. You can actually see, if you look under a microscope, you can see that the shape of these neurons changes subtly. There are structures called dendritic spines, little nubbins, where synaptic contacts from other neurons are received, and they become more dense. The electrical properties of these neurons change. Their chemical properties change. So this is an explicitly biological phenomenon. So what does this mean in terms of how we should think about addiction? What it means is that when we understand the interplay of genetics and early experience and stress, any one of us can be an addict. Addiction is not just the disease of weak-willed losers. Addiction is a brain dysfunction. And what this means is that the only model of addiction that makes sense is a disease model. And the only attitude towards addicts that makes sense is one of compassion. And you might think to yourself, you goddamn liberal hippie, I can see your ponytail there. You're trying to get all political here. What about free will? What about personal responsibility? I mean, don't these things enter into it? Well, let me tell you how I think about it. Right? You go into the cardiologist, and the cardiologist says, you got heart disease. We don't say, you suck. You have heart disease. Fuck you. You're a bad person. You have heart disease. No. We say, look, you got a disease in your heart. But now that you know you have heart disease, you have a set of obligations. And these obligations, if you want to live well, you need to eat a heart healthy diet, you need to exercise. exercise, you need to take your statin drugs, and if you don't do those things, it's not society's fault, it's your fault. And that should be our attitude towards addicts as well. We should say, look, just like that guy had something wrong with his heart, what's wrong with your brain? It's not your fault that you're an addict, but now that you are an addict, you need to do some things. You need to actively engage in stress reduction strategies every day for the rest of your life, because nobody can live a stress-free life. What are these stress reduction strategies? There's things like exercise, meditation, prayer, playing with your dog, whatever works. You need to avoid the triggers that you've come to associate with your addiction: music, food, people, places that you have learned to associate with your compulsion. And where they're available, you need to take that are safe and effective. Right now, there aren't very many of these. You need to take anti-craving medication. And you need to get in social support, because breaking addiction is something that's extraordinarily difficult, and it's particularly difficult for people to do. If there's one thing you know, it's that when you do it in a group, it doesn't have to be a group that has anything to do with a religious affiliation. It can be any kind of group, but when you do this in a group, your chance of succeeding is much higher. Now, a lot of us say, oh, all right, okay, I'm on with, yeah, so something like drug addiction, yeah, it's a disease, I'm down with that. But look at that fat guy walking down the street. He just can't control himself. He eats too damn much. Yeah. About 90% of cases of obesity are essentially food addiction. Most obesity doesn't come from metabolic changes. Mostly comes from overeating. And it comes from the same sorts of modifications in these circuits that give rise to addictions to gambling or substances. Why do we have such a hard time with this? Well, it's because in order to come to terms with this, we have to come to terms with the fact that we are all subject to strong subconscious drives and motivations. All of us, not just other people, but all of us. And I think that's a threatening thing. We don't enjoy feeling that we're not entirely driving us, but we're not entirely driving us. So you might think, well, all right, I get it about how genetics. You've told me that dopamine is important for feeling pleasure, and you've told me that there are genetic factors. So I get it. It must be that people who have a greater propensity for addiction are those who get a super big blast of dopamine when they engage in one of these behaviors. And so it feels extra good to them, and they're more motivated to do it again, and that's why. And that's a completely reasonable idea that a lot of people held for years and years, and it turns out to be 180 degrees. Absolutely wrong. It's just the opposite. So it turns out that actually if you inherit gene variants that attenuate dopamine signaling within your pleasure circuit, what that means is that in order to get the same amount of pleasure that someone else could get with moderate consumption, you've got to overdo it. So I'm fortunate. I don't have a problem with addiction. I go to the bar, have 2 whiskeys, feel a little tipsy, have some fun, go home. My friend Ned, unfortunately, carries a gene variant of the dopamine receptor that means that his pleasure circuit is damped down. In order to feel as I do with 2 whiskeys, he's got to have 10 whiskeys. So the way it works is actually hypofunctioning. It's actually poorly functioning.